Sebastian Cole didn't build Arcadia systems by tolerating chaos. At 44, he was the kind of man whose life was engineered down to the second. He wore custom suits that never wrinkled drank water at precisely 72 F and traveled only on aircrafts where he knew the crew by name. On a first-class flight from New York to London, one he had taken dozens of times, she expected the usual silence, soft leather, and the familiar taste of seared tuna with vinaigrette. What he received instead was a single flaw, a patch of green mold hidden beneath a delicate slice of fish. Small, quiet, but unforgivable. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fuss. Instead, Sebastian did what no one expected. He calmly picked up his phone, typed a few words, attached a photo, and sent an email to the CEO of Sovereign Airlines. Within minutes, he had terminated the entire flight crew. Every single one. Lead flight attendant, junior staff, the weary purser, fired mid-air at 35,000 feet. The silence that followed was deafening. To Sebastian, it was simple. Standards had been breached. Accountability was non-negotiable. When you paid $10,000 for a seat, you didn't accept mold. But to the world watching through the digital lens of headlines and hashtags, the story was far less straightforward. Some called him a hero, a man finally holding airlines accountable. Others labeled him a billionaire, wielding power like a weapon, punishing working-class employees over what they saw as a minor mistake. And then the twist came. The mold wasn't an accident. It wasn't kitchen carelessness or a failure of food safety. It was intentional. Patricia Langston, the lead flight attendant he had so publicly dismissed, had done it on purpose. Beneath her crisp uniform and rehearsed smile was a vendetta. Her husband had lost his entire retirement savings in a corporate takeover engineered by Arcadia Systems. By Sebastian. The moldy fish was her act of revenge. A silent, calculated strike designed to humiliate him, knowing full well that a man like Sebastian wouldn't let it slide. She had set the trap, and Sebastian, true to form, had sprung it. The revelation hit the media like a bomb. Overnight, public opinion flipped. Now Sebastian was no longer the villain. He was the victim of corporate sabotage. News anchors apologized. Commentators who had mocked his ego-driven tantrum rushed to revise their takes. Sovereign Airlines issued a formal apology and offered him lifetime access to their highest-tier service. His board of directors, once furious, now praised his swift response and commitment to integrity. And yet Sebastian couldn't celebrate. Standing alone in his London penthouse overlooking a skyline he once conquered, he felt something far colder than vindication. He felt hollow, because beneath all the praise, he knew something the public didn't. He had fired more than just Patricia. He had fired Elena Morales, a 25-year-old junior flight attendant who had done nothing but stand silently afraid to speak up. He had fired Gerald Shaw, a man 2 years from retirement, whose only mistake was not controlling a superior who outranked him. They were not conspirators. They were collateral damage. And Sebastian had destroyed their careers without a second thought, not because of facts, but because of pride. It was Elena's email that broke through the noise. No anger, no threats. Just a line that stopped him cold. I am not Patricia, Mr. Cole. I was just afraid. That night, Sebastian didn't sleep. He didn't scroll market data or review acquisition reports. He sat in silence, confronting a truth he had buried for years. His success had become a shield and a sword. He had risen through the ranks of a world that never wanted him, built a legacy out of precision, and now at the peak, he had turned that legacy into a weapon of overcorrection. For the first time in decades, Sebastian questioned not the world but himself. The world had moved on. The scandal was over. But for Sebastian, it had just begun. The sun was setting over London, casting a coppery hue across the skyline. But Sebastian Cole barely noticed. He sat in the center of his penthouse, 34 stories above the River Thames, staring blankly at the tablet in his hands. On the screen, Elena Morales' email glowed softly, its language simple, direct, and utterly disarming. I saw the mold on the plate when Patricia walked past me. I should have said something. I didn't. I was scared. But I'm not her. I was just trying to survive my shift. He read those lines again and again, each time feeling them cut deeper. She hadn't begged. She hadn't threatened legal action or demanded reinstatement. She had done something far more dangerous. She had told the truth without flinching, and in doing so peeled away a layer of armor that Sebastian had spent his entire life forging. He had always believed in precision data structure systems, but here was something messy, human. It didn't fit into a graph or a boardroom decision tree. It was a reminder that behind every uniform was a story, behind every name tag was a beating heart. Sebastian stood and walked to the window, watching traffic blink far below like circuit boards. His Empire Arcadia systems had been built on the promise of optimization tools to make decisions faster, better, cleaner. He had eliminated inefficiencies in thousands of companies, but there was no algorithm for remorse, no code that could correct a decision made in anger and fueled by pride. He thought of Gerald Shaw, 257 Gray, at the temple's hands always folded behind his back, a professional, seasoned and calm. He had handled Sebastian's complaint on the plane with quiet grace, though clearly outmatched by the moment. Sebastian had fired him without so much as a second glance. And Patricia Langston. Her actions were reprehensible, deliberate, cruel. But even now, knowing the whole story, Sebastian couldn't stop thinking about the moment her eyes flickered, just for a second, as he pointed to the mold. Beneath the practiced expression of service, there had been something else. Something tired, something broken. Patricia hadn't just set a trap. She had cried out from the wreckage of her own life. The problem was he hadn't seen it. Not clearly, not in the moment. He had acted like a CEO, not like a man. And now the world had forgiven him, but he hadn't forgiven himself. The next morning, Sebastian asked his driver to take him not to Arcadia's Glass Tower headquarters, but to a modest cafe in Notting Hill. There, waiting for him in a corner booth with a mug of tea gripped in both hands, was Sarah Jensen, the journalist from the New York Times. The one who had first broken the story, then flipped it on its head. She stood as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Cole." "Just Sebastian," he said. She gestured for him to sit. "I take it this isn't about damage control." "No." He took a breath. "This is about telling the truth. All of it." The interview lasted 2 hours, and this time Sebastian didn't deliver sound bites or brand-safe deflections. He laid it bare. The fury, the humiliation, the satisfaction of retribution, the gnawing guilt that followed. He talked about Elena, about Gerald, about the look in Patricia's eyes. He said what few men in his position had ever said aloud. "I acted like a man who had never been taught how to pause. I responded like someone who has spent his whole life fighting to be seen and forgot that others are fighting too." Sarah listened without interrupting, her pen gliding across the page. By the end of the week, the article was live. "I was wrong," Sebastian Cole on Power Rage, and the flight that changed everything. The story spread like wildfire, but this time not because it was scandalous, because it was sincere. Viewers from all walks of life, executives, flight attendants, single parents, retirees, shared their thoughts. Comments flooded in. "I've never heard a CEO talk like this. We need more leaders who understand what power really costs." The transparency shocked the corporate world, but what happened next shocked them even more. Sebastian didn't stop with words. He reached out to sovereign airlines and used every bit of leverage, from his 12% investment stake to demand the reinstatement of Elena Morales and Gerald Shaw with full back pay and a public apology. For the rest of the crew who couldn't return, he set up a private restitution fund covering 2 years' worth of salary and providing job placement support. He refused Sovereign's lifetime flight offer. "This isn't about perks," he told the press. "It's about responsibility." As for Patricia, he declined to press charges. "She acted out of pain," he said during a follow-up interview. "And I won't return pain for pain. What she did was wrong. But accountability and vengeance are not the same thing." Then came the most uncharacteristic move of all. Sebastian stepped back from everything. He canceled a keynote address in Tokyo, delayed 2 high-profile acquisitions, and for the first time since he founded Arcadia, he took a leave of absence. Not because the board demanded it, but because he needed to understand who he had become. He started therapy. He read books not on optimization, but on empathy. He called his estranged sister in Oregon. He stopped traveling by private jet, started taking commercial flights in business class, sitting quietly by the window, headphones, and listening to classical music and thinking about every person in uniform who passed down the aisle. The transformation wasn't loud. It didn't trend for weeks, but it was real. His employees noticed it first. Then the board, then the world. Months later, he returned to Arcadia not as the man who built it, but as the man who had learned how to rebuild himself. He rewrote the company's mission statement, banned internal power rankings, implemented leadership training that included not just strategic thinking, but emotional accountability. And perhaps most telling of all, he started ending every quarterly meeting with the same question: what does success cost and who's paying the price? 1 year after Flight 7, Arcadia was named one of the top 10 most ethical companies in the U.S., not because of revenue growth, but because of how they treated people when no one was watching. And what of Elena? She returned to the skies, this time as a lead flight attendant. Her confidence grew, so did her grace. She no longer stayed silent in the face of injustice. She trained new hires on not just safety protocols, but emotional presence. Pay attention, she told them, not just to passengers, but to one another. She kept a printed copy of Sebastian's apology in her locker, not out of pride, but as a reminder that sometimes people really can change. Gerald Shaw retired 6 months later, peacefully, quietly, with a handwritten note from Sebastian and a first-class flight to anywhere in the world, courtesy of Arcadia. And Patricia. Her story didn't have a neat ending. She disappeared from public view. But 1 year after the incident, an anonymous donation appeared at a community counseling center in Newark, New Jersey, the same center where Patricia had recently started attending anger management sessions. The amount covered a full year of group therapy for every participant. Sebastian never spoke about it, because some apologies are loud, and others come in the form of quiet, sustained repair. It didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. Redemption, real redemption, isn't a headline. It's a slow, stubborn process. It starts in whispers, not applause. For Sebastian Cole, the aftermath of Flight 7 had shifted from scandal to self-examination. His public apology, the reinstatement of Elena Morales and Gerald Shaw, and the creation of a restitution fund had all made headlines. But the real transformation, the one that mattered, was quieter. It started in boardrooms, break rooms, and the space between assumptions and empathy. At Arcadia Systems, employees returned from the weekend of Sebastian's New York Times interview with cautious curiosity. Some expected a PR stunt. Others thought it was a calculated reset. But within weeks, it became clear something fundamental had changed. The man who once ran 80-hour work weeks like a machine had begun canceling meetings to listen, truly listen to people he used to overlook. He met with engineers in the basement of Arcadia Tower to understand how product deadlines were affecting their health. He sat in on diversity council sessions, not to be briefed, but to learn. He asked receptionists how often they felt respected. He walked floor to floor without an assistant or announcement, just observing how people moved, where they hesitated, who they avoided. Sebastian Cole had become an internal case study. The man once known for strategic coldness was now asking questions that had no data point answers. Are we treating people like assets or like humans? What don't I know because people are afraid to tell me? How do we create a company where dignity isn't a luxury but a given? The ripple effects spread. Managers started holding pause, review weekly check-ins where employees could flag not just performance issues, but moments of emotional discomfort or ethical conflict. Anonymous surveys were revamped to include a respect index, and a new principle quietly emerged across departments: efficiency matters, but not at the cost of humanity. Outside Arcadia, the story of Flight 7 took on a life of its own. Universities began referencing it in business ethics lectures. One Ivy League professor even opened his semester by posing the question, "What would you have done if you were Sebastian Cole before, during, and after?" It sparked fierce debate among students. Some said they would have done exactly what he did: fire the crew, defend their reputation, move on. Others argued that the real leadership came after the fact, when he paused, reflected, and took responsibility without excuse. One student, an older Marine Corps veteran returning to finish his MBA, offered the most striking observation. He did what many of us are trained to do: eliminate threats. But true strength is in restraint. It's in knowing when not to pull the trigger. The clip of that moment went viral on social media. Thousands commented. The Cole lesson began trending, not because people idolized Sebastian, but because people saw themselves in him: the overcorrecting boss, the triggered employee, the quiet witness. The line between justified reaction and overreach was suddenly being examined in homes and offices, in churches. Flight attendants from other airlines began sharing their stories of microaggressions, toxic passengers, and the emotional tightrope of serving people who viewed them as disposable. Some wrote letters to Arcadia's foundation, thanking them for highlighting the often ignored emotional labor of service workers. Others, especially from marginalized communities, praised Sebastian for addressing what so many feared naming, that anger, even righteous anger, can still cause harm when it forgets the people around it. Months later, at a leadership symposium in Washington, D.C., Sebastian was invited to speak not as a tech mogul, but as a case study in ethical failure and growth. He stood before 800 executives in a navy blue sweater, no blazer, no prepared notes. And he began like this: "I'm not here to give a TED Talk. I'm here to tell you how I broke something and what it took to learn how to fix it." He spoke for 45 minutes. He didn't mention revenue or strategy once. He talked about Elena's email, about Gerald's silent professionalism, about Patricia's pain, about the mirror he saw when he realized he had become a man who responded to disrespect with destruction. When he finished, the room was silent, not from lack of applause, but from weight. Many of those present had made similar calls, firing teams, canceling contracts, terminating without warning. Few had ever considered the invisible cost of those decisions. After the event, one CEO approached him. "You said something on that stage I haven't stopped thinking about," he said. "You said I didn't lose control. I used control as a weapon. That's exactly what I've done. For years." Sebastian didn't reply with advice. He just nodded. Sometimes acknowledgement is more powerful than instruction. Back in New York, Arcadia continued its quiet evolution. At Sebastian's suggestion, the company implemented Compassion Credits, a peer-nominated recognition system for moments when an employee showed grace under pressure. It wasn't about productivity. It was about presence. And it changed everything. One of the first recipients, a janitor named Marcus, who had quietly fixed a broken coffee machine 5 times without complaint because he didn't want his team blamed for recurring malfunctions. Another data analyst who stayed late 3 nights in a row to coach a nervous intern preparing for their first client presentation. Each story was shared internally in a monthly bulletin. And every time Sebastian read them, he felt something shift in his chest. He was no longer chasing perfection. He was building something durable. Meanwhile, Elena Morales was flying again. As lead flight attendant on Sovereign's New York-London route, she had become known not just for professionalism, but for her emotional intelligence. One evening, a man in 2A, clearly frustrated, began berating a young crew member over a seating issue. Elena walked over, calm, grounded. "Sir," she said softly, "I understand your frustration, but please know that how we speak to people matter. 7 at 35,000 feet. The man blinked, then sighed, and apologized. Later, that crew member would tell Elena, "I've never felt so protected." "Thank you." Elena just smiled. That's the job, she thought. Not just serving meals, but serving grace. She didn't mention the flight that changed her life. She didn't have to. It lived in how she carried herself, in how she taught her team, in the deep, quiet resilience of someone who had once been erased and found her way back with dignity. And what of Patricia Langston? Her name faded from headlines. Sovereign Airlines had fired her quietly after the internal investigation confirmed the sabotage. She lost her license, her pension, her career. Her husband left her. For a while, she bounced between temp jobs, hostess, receptionist. One day, she found herself standing in the back of a church basement in Newark, staring at a folding chair in a circle of strangers. It was an anger management group. She didn't speak for the first 3 sessions, just listened. But one evening, a young man shared how he destroyed his marriage with a single outburst. Something cracked. Patricia raised her hand. "My name is Patricia," she said, voice trembling, "and I ruined my life. I didn't scream. I didn't hit anyone. I just quietly hurt someone because I thought I was invisible, and I wanted him to feel it too." There were no gasps, just nods. And that was the beginning. What she never knew was that the community center received a quiet, anonymous donation each year, enough to keep the group free and running. The check was always from the Second Circle Fund, a grant created by the Arcadia Foundation in the wake of Flight 7. Sebastian never spoke of it. He didn't want credit. Some things are not for headlines. They're for healing. A year after the incident, Sebastian sat once again in Arcadia's boardroom, watching a new generation of leaders present ideas that didn't just focus on growth, but on balance, equity, and impact. He felt proud, but not of the company's market position or valuation. He was proud of what they were becoming. As the meeting ended, a young product lead named Devin pulled him aside. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I used to think I had to act like you, like the old you don't make it. Now I realize I don't." Sebastian paused, looked him in the eye and said, "Then I've done something right." In the end, Flight 7 wasn't just about moldy tuna or corporate overreaction. It was about what happens when pride meets pain, when control meets consequence. It was about what we do after the damage is done. And for Sebastian Cole, redemption didn't come in a press release. It came in the slow, humbling practice of repair. In the decision to build, not just faster tech, but a better legacy. Because in the end, the real flight wasn't across the Atlantic. It was inward. The glass walls of Arcadia's executive suite offered an unbroken view of Manhattan's skyline, cold, beautiful, immaculate. But Sebastian Cole wasn't looking outward anymore. He was staring at his own reflection. It had been 16 months since Flight 7. 16 months since the mold, the firing, the scandal, the twist, the confession, the reckoning. Since then, he had watched his public image rebound, his company grow stronger, and his employees speak of a new culture that felt more human. Yet the real work hadn't been public. It had been personal. Each morning he began with the same ritual. He would sit by the window, sip coffee from the same plain ceramic mug, and write in a black leather notebook, never digital. The entries weren't business strategies or shareholder memos. They were questions. Why did I need control so badly? What part of me was afraid that kindness would make me weak? When did my standards become walls? Some pages were angry, some were ashamed, some were quiet and full of longing. But over time, the voice that had once demanded perfection had started asking for something deeper: peace. He didn't know when exactly it had begun to change. Maybe it was the way Elena Morales had smiled when they met again, not as adversaries, but as survivors. Maybe it was the old postcard from Gerald Shaw sent from Tuscany with 2 words scribbled on the back, "Still flying." Maybe it was therapy. In those sessions, confidential, unstructured, often uncomfortable, Sebastian had come face to face with truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He learned that much of his drive had been born in invisibility. As a young, brilliant black engineer in a room full of powerful white men, he had been overlooked, dismissed, patronized, told to smile more, to be grateful, to be less intense. He learned that his obsession with control had been his armor. If he controlled everything, then no one could ever humiliate him again. If he demanded excellence from others, he would have to confront the parts of himself that still felt unworthy. But the most painful truth: his power had become a mirror of the very forces he had once fought against. He had become the gatekeeper, the punisher, the judge who didn't ask questions, just handed down sentences. One evening, while flipping through old digital archives from Arcadia's early days, Sebastian stumbled across a folder labeled "First Flight." Inside were photos from the company's first product launch. He looked younger, less polished, smiling with a team of 20-somethings huddled around mismatched laptops. One photo showed him standing on a coffee table, holding a whiteboard marker like a microphone, shouting a half-formed idea about humanizing technology. He didn't remember the exact words, but he remembered the feeling: possibility. That version of himself hadn't built Arcadia to dominate. He had built it to liberate, to free businesses from clutter, to empower teams to make the world more navigable. Somewhere along the way, he had traded that mission for metrics. And now, 16 months after a moldy piece of fish cracked his kingdom open, he wanted to return to the why. But not just within Arcadia. The real challenge was outside the skyscrapers. Sebastian began visiting schools in underfunded districts quietly, without press, without fanfare. He wanted to meet young people who reminded him of who he had once been: brilliant, overlooked, underestimated. At one high school in the Bronx, he sat on a plastic chair while a group of teens pitched to startup ideas as part of an after-school entrepreneurship program. One girl, barely 15, stood up and presented a mobile app that helped elderly people understand prescription instructions using voice prompts and AI translation. When she finished, her hands trembling slightly, Sebastian asked, Why this idea? She shrugged. My grandma takes like 10 pills a day. The labels are tiny. She gets confused and misses doses. I thought maybe this could help. Sebastian didn't respond right away. Then he smiled and said, I'd like to fund it. The room erupted. But for Sebastian, it wasn't about the money. It was about connection. About listening for the first time in year, not to investors, not to critics, but to the quiet brilliance of ordinary people solving real problems. He started a new initiative under Arcadia's philanthropic wing, the Quiet Spark program. It funded youth-led innovation in underserved communities. But the catch no one could apply. The foundation found them. They looked for unnoticed brilliance, a science project tucked in a notebook, a prototype built from scraps, a story scrawled in the margins of a test. Each quarter, they selected 10 students and gave them resources, mentors, and the most valuable thing of all, validation. Sebastian personally met with each one, not as a CEO, as a man who had once wanted anyone to say, I see you. Back at Arcadia, things continued to evolve. A new internal program called the Second Conversation encouraged employees to revisit past conflicts, those hallway tensions, passive-aggressive emails, or moments where someone had been steamrolled in a meeting, and talk about them, not to assign blame, but to repair. The idea came from Sebastian's therapist. Most of the damage in corporate culture, she said, doesn't come from big mistakes. It comes from small wounds that never get acknowledged. The result, fewer resignations, more mentorship, and an uptick in something that couldn't be measured in charts: emotional safety. Sebastian made sure interns were now paired with mentors who didn't just teach strategy, but also taught listening. Exit interviews were no longer just HR formality, they were data for improvement. Even job postings changed. They stopped using phrases like rockstar fast-paced or killer instinct and started emphasizing collaboration, patience, and adaptability. Because Sebastian no longer believed in building a company filled with warriors. He wanted to build a company of builders. But not everyone embraced the new Sebastian. Some board members grumbled that he had gone soft. One investor pulled out, saying Arcadia was leaning too far into social ethics. Competitors started mocking the internal culture changes, calling it Silicon Valley soul-searching. Sebastian didn't flinch. In one quarterly shareholder meeting, he addressed it directly. If this company is only strong when we act like machines, he said, then we've already failed. I didn't start Arcadia to win at any cost. I started it to change the cost of winning. The room was silent. Then Marcus Thorne, the oldest board member, the same man who had once harshly criticized Sebastian during the Flight 7 fallout, stood and nodded. You're building something that might actually outlast you, he said. That's rare. Sebastian swallowed hard. It was the closest thing to a blessing he'd ever received from Marcus. 2 years after the flight, Sebastian took a walk through JFK's Terminal 4 before boarding a commercial flight to Amsterdam. No assistant, no entourage, just a Navy travel bag and a quiet mind. He passed a newsstand and noticed a headline on a magazine tucked in the corner, Rebuilding from the Inside Out: The Rise of Ethical Tech. His photo was on the cover. He didn't buy it. Instead, he walked toward his gate. As he approached, he noticed a flight attendant helping an elderly woman lift her carry-on into the overhead bin. The woman smiled and whispered, "Thank you, dear." The attendant turned. It was Elena Morales. Their eyes met. She smiled, not a smile of celebrity recognition or professional obligation, but something warmer. "Hi, Mr. Cole," she said. "Sebastian," he corrected, smiling back. "I'm flying the late shift today. It's quiet, peaceful." "I've learned to love quiet," he said. She paused, then said, "Thank you for everything. I never got to say it properly." "You already did," he replied. Then he reached into his jacket and handed her something, a small folded note. "For the moments you didn't speak, but still mattered." She opened it. Inside was a check, not extravagant, but generous, made out to the flight crew. Mutual assistance fund she now co-chaired. He had written one word in the memo line: legacy. That night, as the plane cut through clouds over the Atlantic once again, Sebastian leaned back in his seat. He didn't open his tablet, didn't review a contract, didn't analyze stock performance. He closed his eyes. Not out of exhaustion, but peace. The same sky that once held his greatest undoing now held his quiet redemption. No one on the flight knew who he was, and for the first time in his life, he was fine with that. Because the true mark of legacy isn't in how loudly the world speaks your name, it's in how gently you change the lives that will never know it. 3 years after Flight 7, the world no longer spoke of moldy tuna or a billionaire's fury at 35,000 feet. The headlines had faded, the media cycle moved on, and yet something quiet and fundamental had shifted. In corporate circles in tech, think tanks, in human resources departments across the globe, the question wasn't, what did Sebastian Cole do? But rather, what are we doing differently because of it? This wasn't a rebranding campaign. It wasn't a trendy social initiative. It was a ripple. And in the corporate world, where momentum usually favored profit over people, a ripple that lasted 3 years was rare. But this one was growing. At a leadership summit hosted by Stanford's Center for Ethical Innovation, the keynote panel wasn't filled with Fortune 500 CEOs or flashy disruptors. Instead, it opened with a conversation between a former Arcadia intern turned team lead and a former HR director at Sovereign Airlines who had quietly redesigned their crew discipline protocols after the Flight 7 incident. The topic, when the power shifts accountability culture, and the second decision. The term second decision had entered the lexicon in recent months, coined in a viral article by a behavioral psychologist who had studied Sebastian Cole's story in depth. The first decision is instinctual, emotional. It's how we respond when we're triggered. The second decision is where growth begins. It's the moment we choose reflection over reaction. Sebastian in many ways had become the embodiment of the second decision, not just for what he did in the sky, but for everything he chose to do after landing. That framing became a cultural pivot point. It was no longer just about what went wrong. It became about what comes next. Other companies took notice. Arcadia's quiet policy changes, once considered too soft or too philosophical, began showing hard results, not just in retention or satisfaction scores, but in resilience. During a downturn in the tech sector, where companies across Silicon Valley laid off thousands, Arcadia implemented a shared sacrifice model. Executive bonuses were frozen, stock options deferred, and high earners volunteered to reduce hours to keep junior staff employed. It worked. More importantly, it spread. Within a year, 8 other mid-sized tech firms adopted the model. 3 credited Arcadia directly. In interviews with the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, executives kept referring to what they called the Cole Curveus shift in how leadership was measured. He redefined strengths, said Jenna Price, CEO of Terralink. He showed us that emotional intelligence doesn't dilute authority, it earns trust. But Sebastian never returned to the spotlight. He declined speaking engagements, turned down documentaries, politely refused TEDx invitations. When asked for public comment, he offered only brief statements, measured, sincere, devoid of performance. Instead, he focused on something else: the next generation. Through the Quiet Spark program, now in its 4th year, Arcadia had funded over 130 youth-led innovation projects across 29 states. Some were modest apps for dyslexic learners, solar-powered backpack chargers, AI-driven safety alerts for domestic abuse victims. Others unexpectedly exploded in scale. One in particular caught the public's attention. A group of high school students in Detroit, mentored by Arcadia engineers, developed a platform called Echo Bridge, a real-time translation device for hospital staff treating patients who didn't speak English. The project had started after one of the students' grandparents had a stroke and nearly received the wrong treatment due to a language barrier. When it launched in beta, over 300 clinics across the U.S. requested access within the first month. But when the press tried to reach out to the donors or corporate backers, they found no logos, no branding, no banners. Only a statement on the footer of the website. This technology was made possible by those who believe redemption is real and that silence can be transformed into service. Sebastian never attached his name. Meanwhile, inside Arcadia Tower, a shift had begun to solidify, not as a phase but as a culture. It began with small things. Quarterly perspective days where employees from every department were invited to shadow roles outside their own. Engineers working alongside customer service designers, sitting with finance executives, folding chairs at the lunchroom during onboarding sessions. End-of-day reflections, a 5-minute space at 4:55 p.m. for anyone to log off early and reflect. No tracking, no forms. Just time to breathe and think. Monthly failure forums where teams openly shared mistake, Product missteps, failed pitches, hiring error. With one rule, no punishment, only learning. Sebastian didn't invent these programs. He empowered his people to create them. I used to believe leadership was about vision, he said during a closed-door strategy session. Now I believe it's about creating space for others to grow beyond yours. And then came the call from Harvard Business School. They wanted to create a case study, not just on Flight 7, but on the aftermath, the restoration, the policies, the culture evolution. Sebastian was hesitant at first. He worried it would make him the hero of a story that had no true heroes. But they assured him the goal wasn't to glorify, it was to examine. So he agreed on one condition, that they also include interviews with Elena Morales, Gerald Shaw, and even members of Sovereign Airlines' HR department. The study was published under the title, The Second Decision: Rebuilding Leadership After a Public Crisis. It became mandatory reading not just at Harvard, but at Wharton, Stanford, NYU, and Columbia. Students debated it passionately. Could any executive truly change? Was redemption real or just strategic optics? Did the damage done to innocent people justify the growth that followed? Some professors left the final essay open-ended, asking students not for a conclusion, but for a reflection. What is your second decision moment, and what will you do with it? Outside academia, the cultural resonance only deepened. On social media, the hashtag second decision began trending during moments of national controversy when celebrities, CEOs, or politicians were caught in wrongdoing. But surprisingly, it wasn't used to condemn. It was used to ask, now what? What happens after the mistake? What will you choose to build with what's left? Sebastian, watching from the sidelines, sometimes wondered if the narrative had gotten away from him. He never wanted to be a parable. Never wanted his worst moment to become someone else's template for change. But then he'd receive letters, handwritten ones, from teenagers who had lashed out at friends and were trying to make amends, from single moms who left toxic jobs and were building something new from scratch, from retired engineers who had spent decades in silence and now finally found words. He kept them all in a drawer in his study, never reread them, just held on to them. A quiet reminder that the echo of a single misstep, when handled with grace, could become a compass for others. In his personal life, the changes were even more profound. He rekindled relationships he had once let wither, an old friend from college, a former business partner he had once outmaneuvered, and perhaps most importantly, his sister Lydia. They had not spoken in over 10 years, not since a family dispute over their mother's estate. The wounds were old, scarred, but never healed. He reached out after sitting through a grief support session as a guest listener. The call was short. She answered. He said, "Lyd, I was wrong." She didn't reply for 6 seconds, then said, "I know." They met the following week in Portland. No therapists, no advisors, just coffee, cinnamon rolls, and 2 people learning how to lay their weapons down. She later told him something he never forgot. "I always thought you wanted to conquer the world because it never gave you permission to just be in it. But maybe now, you're finally giving yourself that permission." On the 3rd anniversary of Flight 7, Sebastian returned to Heathrow not for business, but to meet a young pilot named Nathan, who had recently joined Sovereign's diversity recruitment program. Nathan had written to Arcadia months earlier, asking if he could thank Sebastian in person, not for the scandal, but for the cultural change that followed it. "My father was a flight engineer," Nathan said. "He told me the story of what happened on Flight 7. At first he hated you, but then he saw what came next. He said he turned a tantrum into a teaching moment. That's rare." Sebastian smiled faintly. "Your father sounds wise." "He was," Nathan replied. "He passed away last spring." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Nathan said, "If you ever want to fly with me, I'd be honored to have you on board." Sebastian didn't need time to think. "I'd like that very much," he said. "The world will always remember Flight 7, but not for the scandal, not for the firing, not even for the twist. The true legacy of that moment lives in the quiet corners where leadership changed, humility returned, and humanity reclaimed its place at the table of power. And in Sebastian Cole, who once ruled with precision and pride, and now walked with presence and purpose, there was no need for titles, applause, or absolution. There was only one question that mattered. What will I choose in my second decision? And every day in every act, he answered it. The wind on the rooftop of Arcadia Tower was colder than Sebastian Cole remembered. It wasn't the kind of rooftop meant for parties or investor showcases. No rooftop bar, No glass railings, just an access hatch, a gravel-coated floor, and the wide, unfiltered silence of Manhattan's skyline. He liked it that way. There were fewer spaces left in his life that didn't try to frame him CEO visionary redemption story parable. But up here there was only the wind and the sky. No identity to manage. No narrative to shape. He came here often now, not to think but to listen. To the echo of planes overhead. To the noise of taxis 6 stories below. To the pulsing question that had lived in him ever since that day on Flight 7. What if I stopped fighting? It was a question that didn't seek a solution, but a surrender. Not a failure, a choice. And the longer he sat with it, the more he understood Sebastian Cole had not reinvented himself. He had finally met himself. He had spent so many years interpreting silence as danger. In childhood, silence had meant his father was angry. In college, silence from professors meant he wasn't seen. In boardrooms, silence after he spoke meant doubt. So he had filled the silence with results, with precision, with unrelenting standards. Until the silence finally fought back, and a white porcelain plate with a patch of mold that tore everything apart. But silence had given something back too. In the wake of the storm, he had discovered that quiet wasn't the enemy. It was the doorway, and now 3 years later, he walked through that door daily, not just for himself, but for others. At Arcadia, Sebastian no longer made product decisions. His role was fully symbolic now, founder in residence, a title that gave him no board vote, no operational control, no daily briefing. He liked it. He showed up once a week, never in a suit, never unannounced. Sometimes he joined product design sprints just to listen to how the new interns thought. Other times he sat at the open concept lunch area and asked the same 3 questions to anyone who'd sit beside him. What are we getting wrong? What would you fix if no one could punish you? What do you wish I had done differently back then? Most people were shocked by the 3rd question. Some were too nervous to answer. But the ones who did always left something behind, a truth, a reflection, a new perspective. And Sebastian wrote it all down, not to correct them, but to correct himself. It was around this time that a young man named Dev Patel in Arcadia Software, lead in his early 30s, approached Sebastian with a proposal. I want to launch a program called the Third Horizon, Dev said. It's not about youth. It's not about crisis response. It's about legacy transition. Show senior leaders step down without stepping away from purpose. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Dev smiled. We've built everything around winning. But no one teaches us how to let go of winning, how to hand off power without resentment or ego. You did that. And we want to learn how. Sebastian didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, let's do it. The Third Horizon became more than a pilot program. It became a cultural movement. Tech leaders, founders, even government officials began signing up, not for fame, not for PR, for something internal. They came to understand the psychological toll of legacy, the trauma of letting go, the pain of watching others carry a vision you once protected with your life. Sebastian never lectured in these sessions. He sat beside them, listened, shared what he had learned, not as gospel, but as wounds turned into wisdom. The core principle, if you can't release the power it owns you, if you can't celebrate your replacement, you've built a cult, not a company. Meanwhile, a surprising shift occurred in the public's perception of Sebastian not toward sainthood, but toward deep trust. He wasn't lionized. He was respected for his honesty, for his restraint, for his refusal to capitalize on the very narrative that had made him famous. He didn't write a book. He didn't sell a masterclass. He never charged a speaking fee. He gave interviews only when the story might help others. And even then he set one condition. This cannot be about my reputation. It must be about someone else's transformation. Back in his private life, Sebastian made changes that didn't make headlines but changed his soul. He moved out of his penthouse, bought a small brownstone in Harlem, started walking Moreno car, no driver, sometimes stopping at bookstores, sometimes parks, sometimes just sitting with a stranger who looked like they needed someone to sit beside them. He began volunteering anonymously at a grief support group once a week. The first night, no one knew who he was. He just said his name was Bastian, and he was learning to process the parts of his life he never mourned. His childhood, the time lost to ego, the people he'd hurt without ever saying sorry. They didn't ask what he did. They asked how he felt. And that made all the difference. Elena Morales and Gerald Shaw had both built remarkable lives since that day in the sky. Elena became a training director for multiple airlines, implementing soft skills development and emotional de-escalation techniques. Her core training module, the passenger and the enemy. Sometimes it's the system. She and Sebastian kept in touch. Once a year, they met at a cafe near JFK. No press, no talking about the past, just coffee, laughter, and the knowledge that both had found their way out of the storm. Gerald Shaw, now retired, opened a small mentoring service for aspiring flight attendants in Florida. He called it Cabin Calm. His slogan, "Your job is 35% safety, 35% service, and 30% sanity." One evening, Sebastian received a letter in the mail. It was from Patricia Langston. He hadn't heard from her in over 3 years. After Sovereign's internal investigation, she had disappeared from the public sphere. Rumors swirled, but Sebastian never chased them. The envelope was plain, handwritten, no return address. He opened it slowly. "Mr. Cole, I've thought about this moment for a long time. Whether to write, whether it would help or hurt, whether you would rip this letter in half. I wouldn't blame you. I have no defense. I knew what I did. I knew what I was doing. And I let pain make a decision that cost me everything. For a long time, I thought I had destroyed you. But the truth is, you became someone I deeply respect. Not because you forgave me, but because you took your own damage and turned it into light. I wanted you to know that I am sober, in therapy, volunteering. I teach job interview prep at a halfway house. No one knows my past, but sometimes when I speak about shame, I think of you. I'm not asking for closure or forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you that your silence, the mercy you showed me, saved my life. With deep regret, Patricia Langston." Sebastian didn't cry, but he sat down, folded the letter, and whispered, "Thank you." And then he did something he had never done before. He wrote her back. One spring morning, Sebastian was invited to give a private talk, not at a university or think tank, but at a high school in the South Bronx. The principal, a woman named Cheryl, had once been part of the Quiet Spark program in its earliest days. "You won't be speaking to donors or press," she told him. "Just 30 students. Some of them don't trust adults. Most of them don't believe in second chances." Sebastian smiled. "I think I know something about that." When he arrived, the students were skeptical. Crossed arms, phones out, walls up. He didn't lecture. He sat on the floor with them, told the story of a mistake served at 35,000 feet, told them how he almost destroyed 3 lives, and then how one letter made him rebuild his own. When he finished, a girl in the back raised her hand. "So like, are you proud of who you are now?" Sebastian paused, then said, "Am not proud, am grateful. I finally feel like someone who doesn't need to win all the time. And that's the first time in my life I've felt free." There was silence, and then the girl whispered, "That's kind of beautiful." That night, he walked the Harlem streets, slowly, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the hum of the city beneath his feet. He had no meetings tomorrow, no flight to catch, no fires to put out. He passed a mural near Lenox Avenue painted by a group of kids from the community center. The words sprawled across the brick in bold yellow letters. "We are not what we were. We are what we choose next." Sebastian smiled. That was it. That was everything. On his 62nd birthday, Sebastian Cole woke up not to a boardroom, a press release, or 1,000 unread emails. He woke up to birdsong, to soft Harlem sunlight leaking through linen curtains, to the smell of fresh sourdough he'd left rising overnight in the kitchen, something he'd learned from a retired baker who ran a free Saturday workshop at the local YMCA. There was no schedule on his calendar, no driver waiting, no urgent texts demanding decisions. Instead, there was something much rarer: stillness. And Sebastian knew this was the day he would begin saying goodbye, not with a press conference, not with a viral blog post or commemorative video, but with a gesture so quiet, so deliberate, that only those who truly watched his story would understand what it meant. That morning, he arrived at Arcadia Tower, not through the executive garage, but through the public street entrance, just like any visitor. The receptionist, a young woman named Dahlia, gave him a warm smile. "Morning, Mr. Cole," he smiled back. "Just Sebastian today. She paused, then nodded as if understanding passed silently between them. He rode the elevator to the 78th floor, the original executive suite that once bore his name, on a frosted glass door. It now belonged to Dev Patel, the quiet, thoughtful leader behind the Third Horizon. Sebastian didn't knock. He didn't need to. Dev looked up from his desk, stood instinctively. "I figured you'd come today," he said gently. Sebastian stepped in, closed the door behind him, and set a small black leather notebook on Dev's desk. "I'm leaving Arcadia for good," he said softly. "Not just from the company, from the story." Dev hesitated. "You sure I am?" Sebastian replied. "You've built something better than what I started. Kinder, stronger, more sustainable. I don't want my shadow stretching across it." Dev reached for the notebook. "What is this?" Sebastian smiled. "My second decision. Every day, for the last 6 years." Inside were pages and pages of handwritten entries, some short, some several paragraphs, all ending the same way. "Today I choose not to win, I choose to listen." SC Dev flipped through the last few pages. The final entry read, March 8th. "Dahlia said my smile looked lighter today. Maybe that means I'm done carrying." SC. He looked up. "What do you want me to do with this?" Sebastian shrugged. "Whatever you do with a compass." They hugged, no corporate handshake, no photos. Just a quiet passing of something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Over the next few weeks, Sebastian began fading from public sight. Not in a scandal, not in death, not even in retirement, but in completion. He declined invitations, closed his LinkedIn, donated most of his wardrobe, shut down his private consulting inbox, transferred ownership of the Quiet Spark Fund to a rotating board of youth alumni. He even canceled his nameplate on the Arcadia Wall of Founders, replacing it with a small etched brass plaque that simply read, "Sometimes the silence is the most powerful line in the code." People noticed, of course, blogs speculated, a few news outlets tried to reach out. But Sebastian offered no quotes, no statements, no last interviews. He just left. And in doing so, he became something rarer than a visionary. He became a man who let go. He spent the following years living slower, walking Harlem's tree-lined blocks in the early mornings, visiting small towns upstate by train, volunteering as a mentor not for startups, but for second-chance job seekers at the public library. He wrote letters by hand, never published, just to people he felt still carried his fingerprints, employees, former rivals, quiet supporters, even critics. In each one, he included a single question: what do you believe now that you didn't before? He never asked for a reply. But he received dozens, some angry, some grateful, some confused. He saved them all. At 70, he traveled to Ghana for the first time, his grandfather's birthplace. He sat by the Atlantic shore in Elmina, staring out at waters that once carried generations into slavery. He cried for people he never met. He whispered apologies to ancestors he didn't even know by name. He left a smooth stone from Harlem on the shore, a marker, a bridge, a release. One autumn day, as the leaves turned gold in Central Park, Sebastian walked past a group of teenagers huddled around a bench. One of them, a tall, sharp-eyed girl with braids and a sketchbook, called out, "Aren't you that guy from the Flight 7 thing?" Sebastian stopped, smiled. Once he said, "But not anymore." The girl nodded, then asked, "So who are you now?" He paused, then said, "Just a man who finally stopped trying to be remembered and started trying to be useful." The girl grinned. "That's cooler than being famous." He chuckled. "I agree. She didn't ask for a selfie. She asked for his favorite poem. He gave her one by Langston Hughes. I tire so of hearing people say, 'Let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day.' I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread." They parted ways, and Sebastian felt lighter, as if something old had just been lifted from his shoulders. When he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, there was no media circus. Only a quiet obituary in the New York Times drafted in advance, per his instructions, with no embellishment. It read, "Sebastian Cole, 1961-43, a man who once made machines smarter, then spent the second half of his life making people feel seen. Survived by those who changed course because of a single-second decision." Arcadia didn't hold a grand memorial. They held a reflection day. Every employee was given time off to do one act of restoration, something meaningful, healing, or redemptive. Across 5 continents, hundreds planted trees, visited mentors, wrote apology letters, started projects they'd long postponed. Elena Morales lit a candle for him at a church near JFK. Gerald Shaw, now in his late 70s, hosted a lunch for 10 new flight attendants and told them a story about a man who once mistook a fish for a symbol of failure, but found instead his freedom. And in a library in Newark, Patricia Langston Older, now grayer, gentler, closed a writing workshop with a quote she hadn't spoken aloud in years: "Karma doesn't punish, it balances." Then she placed a copy of Sebastian's obituary on the corkboard. Underneath it, she pinned a note in her own handwriting: "Your silence saved me. Thank you." And so the story ends not with applause, but with echo. Not with legacy cemented in gold, but in grace. Sebastian Cole did not leave behind a foundation in his name. He left behind people who became foundations for others. He did not build monuments, he built space. And in that space, others learned how to choose again, to pause, to reflect, to lay down power, to listen, to repair, and to whisper quietly in the moments when no one was watching. Today I will not dominate, I will not defend. Today I will decide again. And that more than any empire was the real masterpiece. The story of Sebastian Cole reminds us that true growth doesn't come from success, but from the moments when we falter and choose to rise differently. For older audiences who've lived through decades of victories and regrets, this story offers a profound truth. It's never too late to unlearn old habits, to listen more than we speak, and to become softer without losing strength. Sebastian teaches us that redemption isn't found in perfection or public applause. It's found in quiet accountability and handwritten letters and the courage to ask, "What now?" after a mistake. His journey proves that even the most powerful among us need to be humbled to fully understand the weight of grace. In our own lives, no matter our age, we too have a chance to reflect on how we've used our influence, whether as parents, mentors, or leaders, and to consider how we might lead differently, more gently today. Because the most meaningful legacies are not carved in marble, but in the lives we quietly touch after choosing humility over pride. Sebastian Cole's story isn't just about a mistake, it's about what he chose to do afterward. He could have hidden behind his power, buried the truth, or let his pride speak for him. But instead he listened, he changed, and he gave others a second chance, even when he didn't owe them one. In a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, that takes real courage. If his journey moved you, if you believe in redemption, and if you think the world needs more leaders like him, let him know. What would you say to Sebastian? What advice or encouragement would you offer as he steps into this quieter, wiser chapter of life? Drop your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters too. And if you believe in second chances, go ahead and comment one below. Let's show the world that compassion still leads the way.